Good morning, everyone. It's nice and fresh this morning. Beautiful morning. Slept well. Hope you enjoyed the meetings. Just like to invite Pastor Russell Stanley up here, and we're going to pray with him. In 2015, we went on our ATSM team went on a Bible land tour, and no prizes for guessing who was our tour guide. So just like to pray for you, Pastor, before you start. Yep. Lord, we want to thank you for your love. We thank you for blessing us today. Thank you for Pastor Stanley. Pray, Lord, for your blessing upon him as he speaks. Thank you for his wisdom, his knowledge, and we just ask that you'll bless him, and the words that he speaks, may they change us to make us better Christians and help us to apply it to our lives, whatever he speaks, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. Well, good morning, folks. I trust that you're ready to start. I am, because I know the length of what I've got today, so I'm going to start right now. And they'll keep coming in. They've just missed the introductory part, haven't they? That's all right. Let's get started then. All right, I'd like to today tell you the story of Martin Luther. Some of the time I will be referring to the slides on the screen. Sometime they'll just be passing by. You can read the comment. You'll see where it'll fit into my story as we share the story of Martin Luther. One of the things that I think is important for us to remember for Martin Luther is that he is regarded as the father of the Protestant Reformation. Now, you might wonder why he's called the father of the Reformation. We've already spent time looking at the man who came before him, who passed the message on, and that was Jan Hus. And then he got it from Wycliffe in England. And the story goes, and even if you want to trace it back, to the Waldenses, well, they're the great-grandfathers of the Reformation and all the great-great-grandfathers. I'm not quite sure where you fit them all in, but certainly Martin Luther's impact was greatest of all the reformers. And for that reason, I think he is recognised as the father. And also, I believe, even ahead of John Calvin, who we'll be touching on briefly tomorrow, he defined it more clearly than those who were before him. All right, so let's continue then with our story. Our story with Wycliffe starts in a little town in what was Eastern Germany, and it's called Eisleben. This was his birth town, and also the place where he died, actually. But from our point of view, the interest is that as soon as you move into a town where Martin Luther had anything to do with, whether he lived there, visited there or whatever, you'll find there'll be a monument in the middle of town, and there'll be, recognition of Martin Luther, because he has become a very big part of tourism in Germany today. Many people go almost on a pilgrimage aspect of following the trail of Martin Luther. And you will see some of these panels that are below the various statues as we move along, as they help tell part of the story. But just only about a block away from where the main open area, court area, is there in the centre of town, there is the birth home of Martin Luther. It's a fairly modest home, a two-storey home. Today it's been turned into a museum. These are the photos of, obviously from sketches too, but of his parents, Hans, and also Margareta Luther, and he worked in the mines. There were mines all around the town where copper was being mined, etc. In fact, you can still see that today, the slag heaps that are lying around, and some of them being reworked, as you may see the newness of what's looking at there. So this is, I guess, a fairly rich part of Germany from a mineral point of view, but from our point of view, it's very rich because of what came out of it as far as the Protestant Reformation is concerned. As I said, the house is turned into a museum, a bit of culture, some of the writings of Luther, but probably more writings about Luther. There's just bookcases full of them there. And this particular room always catches my attention, but it doesn't look like this today when you go into it. You've got to buy a postcard. So this is a postcard that you're looking at. Let me tell you the background to the story, because I think this sets the tone for what we're looking at for Martin Luther today. Today, of course, they have heating appropriately with electric heaters or whatever, maybe some gas heaters, etc. Not the old fireplace heaters that would be putting out the smoke. And after a while, the ceiling had to be whitewashed. Now, apparently at one point of time, I would say probably fairly soon after this house became a museum, and I don't know the actual timing of it, someone had the interest to paint what you see there on the ceiling. It's an angel, isn't it? So here was this angel painted on the ceiling with this ribbon. And so it was up there until, of course, the first lot of soot came along and slowly covered it. It disappeared. They whitewashed it again, and then the soot covered up that again, and they whitewashed it again until, and it must be since the days of coloured cameras, because this photo was taken before, obviously, the ceiling collapsed and they lost the art piece. But somewhere back there, probably in the last century, someone realised that under the layers of whitewash and black soot, there was this old painting of an angel. And so they employed artists to come in and to carefully remove the black soot and the whitewash that was there, etc., until they got back to the painting. And they did, as you can see there. And then they used the black soot and the whitewash to create cloud effects by depending how deep they cut back into it as to whether it would be white or black. And so that's how that picture came about. And as I said, you can buy it as a postcard. It's not visible today in the room, but I think it's particularly significant. Notice also the other thing, and this you do see in the room today, there is a swan. It's made of bronze, but there is a swan on a pedestal. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute as well. So here is this angel with the ribbon, and guess what is in the ribbon in German? And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. You thought we were the first to start preaching the first angel's message. No. The first angel's message, or the everlasting gospel part of it, has been preached from all times. There have always been, even sometimes down to a very small handful of people, but in all centuries there have been representatives who have been preaching the everlasting gospel. The gospel as you find it in the New Testament, not the gospel as defined necessarily by the church. And so I find it quite significant that they recognise Martin Luther as someone who was preaching the first angel's message, the everlasting gospel. And when you hear someone talk about this, and we talk about that, we're sharing the everlasting gospel too, remember that there were those before, and Martin Luther really made a big bubble in the line. So let's remember that for Martin Luther. Now, the other thing was that there was this swan, and I've just lost my clicker again, if you would. There was the swan, there we go, thank you, that was standing there on that little pedestal as well. Here's what, and we're talking about Jan Hus yesterday, and I hinted at this, and let me now make the connection. Just as Jan Hus was burning at the stake, he made this statement. He said, "You are going to roast me because I'm a goose." Why did he say he was a goose? Remember what I said? Where did he come from? He came from Hasneck, which was the place of apparently geese. They must have had big flocks and, an industry of growing and selling geese, etc. But that was the name of that's where he got his name from, Hus. He came from the Hasneck, the place of the geese or the goose. He said, "You may roast me because I'm a goose, but behind me there will come a swan who you will sing, and who will sing and whom you will not be able to burn." And people have looked at that statement of Hus's and seen it as a prophecy on Martin Luther. And they see him as a swan. And often you will find in these museums swans, like you see here in this particular case. And it represents Martin Luther. He's the swan that followed Hus. Hus was, if you like, just to use the language that we were looking at, he was kind of that morning star, following Wycliffe, who was the morning star, but he was the forerunner who started something that became much greater. The other interesting thing was, it says, who you will not be able to burn. Martin Luther, despite the controversy that he created across not just Germany, but the whole of Europe, and later in other parts of the world as well, he never died a martyr's death. He died a natural death. So that's an interesting little point that you notice there in the birth house. All right, I'm going to skip the schooling of Martin Luther, where he went to primary school and high school, etc., and get straight into a university. He went off to a town called Erfurt. Now, Erfurt is an interesting town from the point of view that at the time Martin Luther arrived, there was a relatively new university there. In fact, people refer to this as the oldest and the newest university in Germany. Why? Well, the reason for that is the actual starting date of it. I'll give it to you. The starting date for it was 1379. So we're looking at 150 years before Martin Luther, because he arrives there in 1505. And that was the founding of the university, one of the very first in Germany. It closed in 1860 and reopened again just 1994, just 4 years after the reunification of Germany. Can you believe it's 32 years since they knocked those walls down, or that wall down? Amazing, isn't it? But just 4 years later, with the two sides of Germany becoming united there and the money being poured into the east, they restored this university. And so that's the restored university there. However, when you go to it, while it is a restored university, the interesting thing is, the clicker keeps stopping. There we go, we've gone two at a time. Righto. The interesting thing is that the actual portal entryway into the university and the windows out the side as well, that you don't see all of them in this picture, you saw them in the last picture, they are the only things from the original university. And notice above the portal, so I assume that this was included in it, there are these stained glass windows that represent the 4 faculties of the university. And you can see, and we'll start from that side over there, there is theology, represented by the cross and the fish. And then there is law, represented by the balanced scales. Medicine, symbol that we see a lot still today. And I've had trouble with the 4th one. I am assuming from the context that it's the humanities. If somebody has a deeper insight on that one than I do, then I'd be interested to hear in my notes. I still have big question marks around this because I haven't actually verified that. But anyway, which of these does Martin Luther get into? Well, in just a few years, because you can see the years that he was there, from 1501 to 1505, and unlike John Wycliffe, that we would notice took years to get his degrees and so on at the University of Oxford, where he went, Martin Luther got his BA and his Masters within that 4.5-year period. Quite an incredible thing. And as a result of, and they were in the liberal arts, training for the priesthood. He was to... that was kind of in the back of his mind, but he went home at the end of his graduation of his Masters, and his father convinced him to switch to law, because his father, though he worked in the mines, he wanted a good education for Luther, and not only a good education, but he wanted him to kind of step up and get a good foundation in law so that he could become a good lawyer, because that was a good, well-paying job. And also, by the way, Martin Luther's father by this stage was not just a mine worker. He had moved right up the ladder and he was involved in the running and the administration of mines, etc. And he saw the value of lawyers. And so he was encouraged to do that. So that's what he did. Well, he continues with his study of law, and then he goes home for the mid-year break. I really missed one of the most important points. The interesting thing is that by chance, while Martin Luther was here during this period of time, he stumbled across in the library of this university, he stumbled across a Bible. It was a chained Bible. As you can see, all those books there are chained to the shelves or the desk or whatever. And it was a chained Bible, but he stumbled across it, and it was a Latin Bible. And he was intrigued by this because he had never seen one of these. He thought these were only the possession of the priest, and he heard many of the stories from the Bible, from his very faithful involvement with the church. The whole family was very faithfully involved. In fact, he was baptized the very next day after he was born in a church that was just one more block away from where they lived. And so it was a very faithful church family at that stage that he came from. but he was intrigued by this Bible and it just got his attention. And he exclaimed, "Oh, if only God would give me such a book for my own," little knowing what was his future. And that God would more than give him a book, he would use him to translate it into the German language. Let's go on. Yes.
Do we know who his teachers were?
No, I don't know. It could well be there somewhere, but I've never come across it, Calvin. No. Yeah. I do know you're about to hear another part of the story of a significant in his life that pointed him in the direction of the gospel, like we saw with Wycliffe as well. We will see that, and we do know his name, Staupitz. Okay, so here he is. He has come home for this mid-year break, and he's walking back to Erfurt, and about in the coach it only takes about 15 minutes, so I guess it's not too far away from Erfurt. But he comes across this very location, which is where he got caught in the thunderstorm. Now, you've probably all heard this story. In fact, just behind where I'm standing, here he is, first of all, caught in the thunderstorm. And you remember that he calls out, fearing for his life, he called out to St. Anne or Anna, saying, "If you save me, I'll become a monk." Now, the reason why he probably was very much aware of St. Anna, notice that she was regarded as the patron saint of children, where he probably would have heard about her, and minors, what his dad was. And so he calls out to St. Anna, "If you save me, I'll become a monk." And miraculously, in his view at that point of time, he was saved from the storm. And so today they have actually put there this monument, and on all four sides it has engraving in it, but of course it's in German again. And I've just photographed the parts of it, which we're going to refer to. Notice on the left-hand side there, you've got the Reformation mentioned, actually using the word that corresponds to English. Go down to the bottom one, Jungen. I would pronounce it, and excuse me if there are people here today who have a good German understanding of the language. You're probably going to scream at me with some of my pronunciations, but I'll try and do it right. That actually means young Luther. Okay, so it was Luther here who was caught in the thunderstorm. And notice the date, and very significant, the 2nd of July. Don't forget that, 1505. And here he is calling out to St. Anne or Anna, and so on, and marking the space or the spot of where this was. And so that was the experience of Martin Luther at this stage, calling out and saying, "If you save me, I'll become a monk." And of course, he was saved. And so he went back to university, sold his law books, said goodbye to all his law students, and went and knocked on the gate of the monastery that was in town as well. And it's a very significant Augustinian monastery. And notice the date, 17th of July, 1505, and that's on the plaque there as well, but it's probably too small to pick up. And that's the date he knocks on the door, just 15 days after he vowed to St. Anna or Anne that if you save me, I'll become a monk. So he's very true to his word. And one of the things we learn about Luther is that he was very committed to whatever he committed himself to. Very committed. And this became part of his problem once he gets into the monastery. So, okay, he gets into the monastery, and the picture up here on that side, that older building on the far side of that picture, that is actually a restored part of the original monastery from 5 centuries ago. And they initially put him in here because there wasn't enough room in where most of the monks were, around the cloister, etc. And for the first few months, this is where he lived, just adjusting to life in the monastery. But in time, he was able to get access to the quarters of the monks in the convent, I guess we'd probably call it. This is the cloister that you're seeing, which is a complete square walkway that goes right around a hollow area of a sort of garden or courtyard in the middle there. And it became very significant to monks as they, in meditation and just in devotion, kept walking around and around, etc., this courtyard, because they didn't get out of the monastery too much. It was more right here. And of course, he was assigned a monk's room, not much more room than for a bed and a table for his study and a few belongings, and that was it. And by the way, the little photo on the corner here, the last photo here, we are sitting in a little chapel, which was where probably Luther spent most of his time while he was there in the monastery. They had many hours a day in devotion, in worship, in learning, in meditation, etc. This was a very kind of special place for Luther. Attached also, there's a library, and you are looking at the remains in the top photo there. You're looking at the remains of the library as I saw it when I first visited there in 2005. Was the first trip I was able to do. I wasn't leading the tour at that stage, but Carol and I had joined up with the tour, and this is what we saw: a library that was in total ruins, and it had been nicely cleaned up. It had been bombed during the Second World War, and about 30 people were killed by that one strike. They had come seeking protection in the monastery. This is from outside the city, not in the monastery, because it's not a monastery now. They had come in and they thought they'd go into the library and they'd be safe there. But as I said, about 30 people, men, women and children, lost their lives inside that library, and they just left it like that for many years. But when I came back some years later, guess what? And you can see in the bottom two photographs there are the remains of the old library, and above it, and that's the glass building you see in the top photograph, they built a new library and office block for the Lutheran College that this place now is. But they have preserved the remains of that old library, and that way you can get a little bit of the feeling about how Martin Luther, again, using the library, again got onto a source where he began his journey with God over understanding what the salvation was as described in the scriptures. The text that he turned to was this text. Well, didn't turn to, I should say. The text that became very central to his study was Romans 1:17, and it became very central to his experience. The just shall live by faith. And there is a great painting that's been described by, and I'm going to mention a man that Cal and I have talked about a lot, because both of us, well, Cal had a lot of his till he lost them, unfortunately, through water damage, etc. But a gentleman by the name of Frank Boreham. Now, he was a minister of the Scottish Presbyterian Church. He ended up coming, and I think, if I remember right, the dates were about early last century. He came to Australia doing locum jobs for ministers who were going off on study leave or long service leave or whatever leave it may have been, or just taking a break. And he would look after churches, particularly in Melbourne. He also did it in Christchurch, or was it Auckland? Anyway, in New Zealand as well. And he endeared himself to a lot of people here in Australia. And one of the persons that he endeared himself to was our teacher. Cal and I both were at college when Dr. Trevor Lloyd was a teacher there at college, and some of you may know the man quite well. And I can still remember that Dr. Lloyd would get up, and I can remember he used to use it a lot in chapel, and as an education student, Cal, I'm sure he was using it a lot in class as well, and he would be quoting Frank Boreham, because this man wrote extensively, and interestingly enough, most of his writing was about stories and making applications and illustrations, and he had just a magic way of just writing so freely and smoothly. You can understand why an English teacher would take such great attention to his work. As Cal knows, his books today are worth quite a bit of money. I have 3 of the cheaper ones. But some of them, I remember when I went to a second-hand, it was a home where a gentleman was selling second-hand copies of Boreham that he was collecting from wherever he could find people dumping their libraries. He said, "Would you like a copy of that one?" And I said, "Yeah, but how much?" "Oh, that's $1,000 at least to start with." I go, "Oh, no, I'll just leave that one." And this is quite some years ago now. But anyway, Frank Boreham makes a study on this experience. In fact, in the book, A Bunch of Everlastings, the very first illustration he uses in there, because the everlastings here are people, and the very first person is Martin Luther. And he uses this verse and does some research on it. Now, as you'll see in a moment, all right, I'm going to flick through, and I'll come back to that next one. What he found out is that, yes, the verse did not begin in Romans 1:17, but rather it comes from Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 4 and is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. All right? And it was interesting, as he was studying the life of Martin Luther to make up his story to put here in his book, he discovered that there were 3 times in the experience of Martin Luther when this verse became a leap in faith, and then he would plateau along for a while, and you back to the just shall live by faith, and he did another leap, and so it goes. 3 times. I'll take you through those 3 times. This is the first time while he's here at the monastery. And I would like to just go back for a minute and look at this verse in full, because it says here in Romans 1 verses 16 and 17, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." We know this verse so well. Because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. The whole journey is a journey of faith. And then it concludes with the just, from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous, or just as the King James, because that's probably how we've all learned it and how I've used it here, the righteous shall live by faith, or the just. So that became a key verse, and we're going to come across that in a few more times. Now, one of the problems with this was that it was revealing a contradiction in Martin Luther's mind that he could not handle. He had been taught that righteousness and to appease this God who demanded righteousness was our work. And he made every effort to be righteous. He was a good church person. And there in the monastery, it was a good opportunity. You can see here, self-adulation. It's just the illustrations that you could take from his experiences, so how he became frustrated. The verse on one hand was telling him something different, but his background said, you've got to earn it. You've got to perform. And so this became a real struggle for Martin Luther while he was there in the monastery. He never solved it in the monastery, but he got some leads. And here is where his best lead came from. It was a man by the name of Staupitz, Johann Staupitz, and he was assigned to Luther to be his counselor, or as it says there, superior, his confessor. He was to go to Staupitz for his confession. And poor old Staupitz, he really had a little bit of trouble with Martin Luther, because one of his confessions went for 6 hours. And he was digging out every little bit of possible sin in his life and confessing it. And Staupitz was really getting a little bit tired of this, and actually said, well, in fact, on one occasion he said to him, why don't you go and really sin so you've got something to confess? But he began to realise that one of the problems that Martin Luther had is that he did not understand the means of grace through the salvation that's provided, or the means of grace for salvation that comes through us through the blood of Jesus Christ. And this man did have an insight on that. And so as he came to confession and he shared his thoughts, etc., or Martin Luther shared his confessions, Staupitz would then share something with him about the grace of God and the forgiveness of God, and accept the forgiveness of God, and it comes through the blood of Christ. And for Martin Luther, this was a big mindset change. In fact, on one occasion, he himself said, and this is recorded, and here you can see in one of these monuments in the cities, I've actually got a picture of Staupitz and Luther there at confession. But Martin Luther said, if it had not been for Dr. Staupitz, I should have sunk in hell. So that's how he valued and saw what Staupitz had brought to him. Isn't it interesting how God does this regularly? Wait till you hear the story tomorrow about Zwingli, because he had a very similar experience at university. A lecturer who understood something about grace that the others did not, and how that became the spark that set him going. And I believe that God uses these people in very definite ways, even though they may not become the loud voice. Martin Luther eventually becomes the loud voice. All right, let's go on. There in the monastery, there is this church that Martin Luther would have had a little bit to do with. In fact, later on his way to Worms, when he's on trial, which we'll talk about later, he's going to preach to the people from this very pulpit here at the monastery. He has nothing to do with it in the interim, but is invited to come and preach on his way to Worms. And so that's of interest, but probably something of more interest is this. Before the what would have been the altar back in the previous medieval church times for this church, now it's a Lutheran church, but the desk there at the front, there is this, I guess you can see the bricks, and there's a cement area in the middle, and that is actually the gravestone of a particular gentleman known as Johannes Zacharias. And at his graduation, part of the graduation service, and to show the commitment of the person, is that they are going to come along and they're going to lie face down, arms outstretched in the shape of a cross on this gravestone and declare their allegiance and their loyalty to the church. Now, I didn't mention this yesterday because of our time, but Johannes Zacharias, do you know who he was? He was the judge that sent Huss to the flames. So he is that kind of status in the church. And here's Martin Luther vowing his allegiance to the church at this stage. He's still very mixed up in terms of his understanding of God. That will come through as he moves away. He graduates as a priest. He is then, again through the admonitions of Staupitz, he is sent to Wittenberg. And there in Wittenberg, he will spend the rest of his life. He really does not live outside Wittenberg. He will visit for a period of time, and then basically he becomes a captive inside his own little territory there, including Wittenberg and a couple of nearby towns, because at least he's got protection there from the prince of that dominion. And so he stays there. But let's have a look at a few things here very quickly in Wittenberg. All right, in Wittenberg, it's a town that's been restored since the unification, because this is another town that used to be in East Germany. All right, and it's been beautifully done. Lovely to walk around these old towns that have been so well restored and the work that has been done. And you can see here at the Market Square, there are two monuments, one to Martin Luther and one to Philip Melanchthon. Now, Melanchthon was the one who followed Luther. Well, first of all, he was mentored by Luther, and then once Luther died as a younger man, he then continued on with the Reformation and probably contributed to the Reformation as much as Luther did as well, both in support of what Luther said and also writing down. And he was often the one who had to appear at the trials where Luther couldn't go. Melanchthon would go and present a paper and report in Luther's place. So he became a significant person. There is the University of Wittenberg, where Luther, he does go now and commences his studies for his doctoral thesis, etc., as a student, but he's also almost immediately put in as a lecturer here at the university, lecturing in such subjects as, I think his first book, if I remember rightly, I have got this written down here somewhere, it'll probably pop up any minute, but he was lecturing in, I know collectively over a period of time, he lectured in Romans, Galatians, the Psalms, the book of Hebrews was another book that he lectured in, etc., and obviously a great proponent of the teaching of salvation by faith alone in Jesus Christ, and that becomes evident as the years continue. So this is the university where he was. Some of these were his students. Some I noticed their dates are a little bit afterwards, but these plaques are all over the town of Wittenberg, just saying these are the people who have come to this university, because it was a significant university, and Martin Luther had been there. This is where he was accommodated at what was called the Black Monastery, or the Augustinian monastery there in this town. And it was called Black simply because all the monks who came and went from there obviously were totally dressed in black, and that's where it got its name from. It's not anything else intended. And then he's only there a couple of years when he has the opportunity to take his pilgrimage to Rome. Every good monk should take a pilgrimage to Rome. And so partway through the year of 1510, and certainly partway through the year of 1511, Martin Luther is walking, get the map out sometime and have a look. at this to see if you'd like to walk it. He walks all the way from Wittenberg, which is in the northern part, the northeastern part of Germany, all the way right through to Rome. And let me remind you that when you're on a pilgrimage back in these days, you walked all day, usually in a small group, but you were not allowed to talk. It was meditation, taking in perhaps a bit of the beauty of the countryside that they were going through. And that's what it was. They were allowed when they came to their accommodation in the evenings, and there were accommodation points all the way along these trails, and they were allowed to talk then, but not as they walked during the day. That was one of the rules. So anyway, Martin Luther eventually comes to a city in northern Italy before he gets to Rome. It's called Bologna, I think it might be pronounced, an Italian word, Bologna. Bologna. Oh, thank you. You've obviously got some good, I'll try and remember that for the future. While he's here, thank you. While he's here, he falls sick, and he records he felt his sickness was unto death. He felt, in fact, he actually almost decided this is it, and was looking forward to death more than looking forward to recovery because he was so ill. But in that stage, in that state, what happened was this. His mind was going over some of the things that he'd been studying and learning about. Guess what one of them was? The just shall live by faith. And as he started taking that verse in again and taking on the meaning of that verse into his own experience, suddenly his total vitality returned, his health returned, and in a few days' time, he was able to get up and continue his pilgrimage to Rome. Incredible. And so he goes to Rome, and we've got to keep moving to get to Rome too. And he enters in through the northern gates, and if you turn around when you enter in, this is what you see. He faces what's known as the Piazza della Popolo, or the Square of the People. And these massive two big churches with this great big Egyptian obelisk in the middle. And he is overawed at what he sees in Rome. It's, and you'll see a couple of the pictures just quickly as we run around. This is interesting. Just behind, still in that square actually, there is this particular church which he will end up taking a mass in here. He was invited to take a mass in that church while he was there in Rome. Of course, he would have seen the Colosseum, probably a little different as we see the ruins today, but it was known in his day also that in this Colosseum, many Christians during the time of pagan Rome lost their lives and were persecuted there in the Colosseum. And then, of course, there are things like the Arch of Constantine, and Constantine had become a very significant person in the history of the church, well, I guess pagan Rome, and then the church as it followed because in his attempt to pull those two together. And then, of course, you've got the Arch of Titus, another archway, commemoration archway. And you'll notice there the right-hand picture is looking up into the arch of the archway. There are the emblems of the seven-branch candlestick and the table of showbread, etc., that have come from the Jerusalem temple. And so this is from AD 70 that Titus is being honoured and represented there. He would have seen many runes that go right back to pagan Rome. And he would see, as you see on the right-hand side here, and this is actually in the Forum, in the old Roman Forum, and you go around and look at these ruins, and you actually see that there are churches that are built and using the structure of these old pagan temples. In fact, one of the places where that became more evident than most places is the Pantheon in Rome, which, by the way, was being built during the time of Paul. So this is how old the original parts of this building are. And it was a pagan temple. In fact, when you go inside, you are told by the local guides that this hole in the centre of the ceiling, it's a bigger one than that. It would probably be about 10 feet across from how I would guess it would be from standing below it. As the sun came in and moved around in those windows or alcoves that you see there on the bottom row, there would be the pagan gods that the sun would be falling on. And this was a sun-worshipping temple. And as he would continue to look, I don't know, I'm imagining now, did he in his imagination say, why do we have pagan symbols mixed with Christian symbols? I wonder whether in his time they held a mass, because this is what they're doing there today. All the tourists, regularly, there are opportunities for tourists, pilgrim tourists, who come in and have a mass at all these sacred sites, because today this is a Christian church. And so it would be, in fact, just outside, you have this, on the top of an obelisk, an Egyptian obelisk with all its, symbolism of the pagan religion of Egypt. You have, again, the sun, but on top standing the cross. Did he see it that the church was triumphant over paganism? Or was it collectively pulling out some of the ideas based on paganism? Not based on, but bringing out some of those ideas. And this is what really got to Luther. He was just awed about the beauty of the churches. And as he went into the different churches and just saw, these churches that have just got painted leaf gold, or leaf gold, I should say, rather than paint. Some of it is gold paint, but much of it is leaf gold that's just placed over all what you see. And he became rather awed by this. The display of the treasures of the church. And there's the Pope's triple tiara. And there's a photograph I pinched out of an old great controversy that shows the priest living in such luxury that he couldn't understand it compared to how he, out in Germany, lived as a priest, etc. Now, this is what he did not see, because this is a fairly recent addition to the cathedral at the Santa Maria Maggiore. And it's called the Co-Redemptrix. Can you see what it is? Christ on one side of the cross and Mary on the other. And Mary is the Co-Redemptrix. She is helping with redemption. And it's through her that your redemption can come. That teaching was around in his time, but the actual, this Co-Redemptrix symbol wasn't up. That's just a fairly recent thing. And it's interesting, I have noticed that in 2019, the Pope did a disclaimer on this. We do not want Mary called the Co-Redemptrix, and I can't fully yet grasp how he was interpreting that, but maybe sometime I'll get more detail on it. But anyway, he didn't see this either. But boy, something that he was going to do was going to run right across the cause of what was happening here in Rome. In his time, if he had come to the site, old St. Peter's was destroyed, and it was the new St. Peter's had been started, but they had run out of money. And so the foundation stones that had been put down, grass was growing up, and the whole building program had stopped. That's what he would have seen. But very soon, out of his story, we're going to see that that will change. And of course, he wouldn't have seen this also, the veneration that we see as you go in there today and just see, like for example, the way the feet of this statue of St. Peter has been just worn away from the people coming through, from touching and kissing and so on. That's another interesting point there. And then you've got this basilica. Now, this is an important basilica, the Basilica of St. John Lateran, or Giovanni, which is the Italian name for John. Sometimes it's called, the Giovanni Church or Cathedral. It's also the Cathedral of Rome. This is where the chair for the Archbishop of Rome sits here. Now, the other thing I want you to notice, and I think it's my next picture, yes it is, the side of this cathedral, so there's the cathedral there, on this side of it, there is what is known as the Lateran Palace. This is where the Pope used to live before the Vatican was built. And between the Lateran Palace and where the cathedral sits, there was a staircase. All right? It's not there today. The staircase, you've got to turn around 180 degrees, and we've jumped 2 here, I think. Yes, 3. There you go. Turn around 180 degrees, and what you see is this building, which is called the Scala Sancta, and they've removed the staircase out of there into this building where people can still do what Martin Luther did when it was in its original location. All right, so let's go into the Scala Sancta and have a look. Here we find people kneeling on a wooden staircase, climbing the staircase on their knees. It's a wooden staircase because it is covering the stone staircase that's underneath it. They didn't want the stone staircase worn away because the tradition of the church says that this staircase came from when Constantine's mother went to Jerusalem and sent all these relics back home that were somehow connected with the story of Jesus. And one of them was the staircase in in Pilate's palace that Jesus would have walked up to go to trial before Pilate. And that this staircase had been shifted from from Jerusalem to Rome. Some even will still claim miraculously. But I think we would say that if this was the origin of the staircase, that we would probably see it more appropriately being dismantled in Jerusalem and carefully shipped across and reassembled there between the cathedral. Well, the cathedral actually, as you saw it there, is a later cathedral, but shifted across here and used in this way. And so as you climb it, as you can see here, notice, and I'll just read the first one there. It says, if you're climbing up the staircase here, you get a plenary indulgence on all Fridays, if you do it on a Friday, of Lent, and once more each year, on any occasion of one's choice, you get a plenary indulgence. A plenary indulgence is full forgiveness of sins, all right, of what you've done, rather than a partial, maybe just for one sin here or one sin there, etc. And you can see the people there very reverently going up the stairs, and we do not disturb them in that process. I might have disturbed the guard because I wanted to get that photo on the right-hand side, which is getting my camera over the top, but the feet and the legs had gone by that stage, and he pulled me back. That is actually an interesting little bit of brass there attached to the wooden staircase, and there's a glass centre of the brass, and if you look through it, there is a darker patch on the stone staircase below. The claim of the church is that's a drop from the blood of Christ, from his climbing the staircase, that from the crowns maybe descending the staircase. I'm not sure where they see it coming, but it came from Christ, and it was a drop of blood, and it has been treated very reverently, and you can look through the glass and actually see it if you look carefully, but you're not allowed to look too long before you pull back. That's okay. I got the photo. You can go to the top of the staircase via another one and get the folk coming up, and the folk do not mind being photographed in this situation, so we are respectful of them as they do it, but photographing them. And this is the staircase that Martin Luther, at the end of his time in Rome, he came to this staircase. Here, it's now into the second year of his time there. It was probably still within the first 12 months, but we're now into 1511. He's climbing the staircase on his knees, and suddenly it comes burning back to him again, the just shall live by faith. What am I doing? And the controversy right at that point got him so much that he stood up and stormed out, packed his bags, and walked all the way back to Wittenberg, not in a day, many days it would take him to get back home. Now, it's been interesting. The church has made an effort to get rid of that story. And one of their arguments is you cannot find anywhere in the writings of Martin Luther a reference to this experience. I thank Frank Boreham again, because in his article on the Martin Luther in the Bunch of Everlastings, he uses the evidence that comes from Martin Luther's son, Paul, who also became a doctor of theology. And Paul records the story, his son Paul, and he tells how Dad used to time and time again in family worship tell the story about him climbing the staircase on his knees and the just shall live by faith coming to his memory, and the experience that we've just shared with you. He shared it with his family over and over again, and I guess he probably shared it with his congregations, but it never got recorded. But Paul records it, his son. And that's good enough for me. I mean, that's a first-hand, isn't it? A piece of history, and that was good. All right, so we are going to follow Martin Luther then, not all the way back to Wittenberg. We're going to do a big jump, but obviously this verse still burning through his mind. And by the way, that was the third of the 3 times in Martin Luther's experience where the just shall live by faith becomes significant, because as was pointed out by Boreham in his book, yes, it comes from the Old Testament, but it's quoted 3 times in the New Testament, just as there are 3 experiences with Martin Luther where this verse meant a lot to him. Right, we're going to pick up the pace a bit. Can you do that? Can we do that? Right, it comes back to the university. He becomes a professor of theology and begins again in 1512 of lecturing in the university. Now, this photograph, again, postcard, there are two churches you can see that become significant in the story of Martin Luther. This is the Castle Church, where the 95 Theses on the other side, on the door on the other side of the church, on the outside, are going to be nailed. It's called the Castle Church sometimes, or sometimes the University Church, because this was connected to the university of this town. But it's called the castle also because, as you'll notice, it's connected with a wall that goes down here, a castle where the prince of the territory would come, the Elector of Saxony. His name was Frederick the Wise, and when he came to town, he stayed here in the castle, and he became a great friend of Martin Luther's. And it's actually a completed walled castle there with the church being a part of it. Up here, there is the spire that you saw before sticking out of the buildings in the marketplace right there in the centre of the town. This is called the Town Church. And it's really Martin Luther's church where he did probably most of his preaching, but he did preach in both. But it becomes very significant. All right, let's start having a quick look. Here is the Town Church. See, it's standing up, the actual two spires there standing up above or bell towers, the row of buildings that are in front of it. And so we will have a quick look inside, and I'm going to say a quick look. A lot of memorabilia here for Martin Luther. Again, this is the what's called the Reformation altar, and it shows Martin Luther conducting a baptism, a Lord's Supper, and there are 12 people seated around the table there at the Lord's Supper. And it is said that the one closest to him on this side, with his foot out the side like this, is Judas, about to leave, about to betray Jesus. And the interesting thing is this: each of the faces of those people there in this scene, the artist was a very smart person, and he actually used a face from the times of Martin Luther and people from town. So it'd be interesting to know who all those people really were. Down the front here, you see him preaching. And by the way, his first sermon on the topic of the just shall live by faith was preached here in this, from this pulpit where you see him pictured here. And the interesting thing is that after Martin Luther died, the reference is to, here it is, just 2 years after he died, there was a Spanish Catholic group of troops who came to town to try and get a bit more control back for the Catholic side of things in town. And it's actually recorded here that as he entered, one of the soldiers pierced the throat or neck of Martin Luther and shouted out, "Even in death, this beast rages on." If only he knew how much he continues to rage on, so to speak, today. It's just amazing, isn't it? But that is the actual painting that he slashed at, and it has been restored. Yeah, he was attacking Martin Luther in that way. All right. Now, the other church, this is the one that's really of interest to us, the Castle Church. And it's the Castle Church which stands out most significantly. Again, as we said, it's a church where Martin Luther, there's a statue of him in the church, as well as Melanchthon and other key reformers. He preached from here on a number of occasions. And then outside, on the outside of the church, you can see about halfway along, there are the doors there of what we call the Theses doors. All right, that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses up. Now, of course, you can imagine that this is a very popular place for photographs. But can you imagine how upset I was when we came there? I came there with a group of 30 plus people. It must have been, were you on that tour? No. It must have been then in the year 2013 because, or no, maybe 2011 actually. One of the persons who was on the tour was... I don't know if I should tell you his current position, but he's a president of a Southern conference in Australia. And he was upset as I was, because when we got there, and this photo on the right-hand side is this particular year, that's not the door, that's a photograph. And it's been printed onto a canvas because they're doing renovations. Can you see the bottom of the photograph? You can see the scaffolding underneath, etc. And and of course, when we came back the next time, the renovations were completed, and we were happy to have our photograph taken there beside the thesis door. Here he is, Brother Butcher, Pastor Butcher. He snuck back after we all had gone back to our accommodation with a couple of others, got under the canvas and from below, because you can't stand back any further when you've got a canvas up against you, and got his photograph of the doors. People love to get their photograph with these doors, even if you do it without permission. All right, now, here's a story that I'd like to share with you. It's a story that we know part of it, but let me share a bit more. A little further away in a city called Mainz in Germany, there is this cathedral. It's a very significant cathedral because the bishop or archbishop actually of this cathedral actually becomes a significant person. He's on the committee who appoints the popes. And of course you can have a say about yourself being there as well. So anyway, let me tell you the story about what happens here at Mainz. And you can see by these photographs taken inside the church that very significant gatherings are done here in this church. And so they were years ago as well. Here is one man who became the Archbishop of Mainz. His name was Albert Brandenburg. He's a contemporary with Martin Luther. All right? He's a very, this picture seems to show him a little bit older. He was a very progressive young priest. He had barely reached the age of 30 when he already had become a bishop in another church. But Mainz has just lost their archbishop, and he now wants to add Archbishop of Mainz to his collection of positions, being a bishop of another church as well. And so he goes to the church, and they say, well, look, we're happy to accept you as our archbishop, because he was a very talented priest and bishop, and we're very happy to have you. But our problem is this: every time we get a new archbishop, we have to pay 10,000 ducats. Now, I don't know how much 10,000 ducats is, but I know it was a huge amount of money. We'd be talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, had to be paid by the church to the new archbishop. All right? They had just replaced 2 archbishops and the church was broke. And they said to him, we have no money to pay your 10,000 ducats. Now, why did the archbishops want 10,000 ducats? Because it was about that amount of money that the Pope would take from people who were appointed as archbishop. Well, you've got to pay me some money as well. And the archbishop, would have to pay the Pope. So he's got a problem. The church won't pay him. He hasn't got in his pocket 10,000 ducats, and yet the Pope's going to demand it of him. Well, who's the Pope? Here's the Pope. His name was Leo II. And he has a bit of a problem on his hands. This building that I've just shown you, St. Peter's, is in ruins. Well, it's not in ruins. They've started the foundations, but they've run out of money. And along comes what's his name again? Albert. Along comes Albert to Leo, and he says, look, I'm going to become the archbishop there. And one of the reasons why he covered it, because as is said back here, he becomes the primate of Germany, which means he's the representative on the council that appoints the next pope, and he'll become a pope soon, he hopes. And so he's now talking with Leo. What can we do about this situation? They scheme up this idea. I think the Pope schemes it up mostly, but he agrees to it. He says, okay, if you will organise for me collection of money through indulgences, we'll split it. The money that you owe me can be paid off, and he had to go and borrow it, by the way, from a banker. He said that can be paid back by 50% of what we collect from the indulgences. The other 50% will go towards the rebuilding of St. Peter's. Seemed like a good idea to him, so they went for it. And so the two of them who had schemed up this idea together, they put in the plan to sell indulgences so that St. Peter's could be built and so that he could pay his debt. And Tetzel was the man, Johann Tetzel was the man who was commissioned now to go around to the cities around Germany, selling indulgences, and his phrase, his catchphrase was, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And you can appreciate, literally thousands of people came in and brought these indulgence tickets, which gave them forgiveness of sins. And in fact, depending what you got, was whether it was past, present, and future, depending on how much you paid, etc. One smart guy came in and paid for past, present, and future sins. And this was told to me, by the way, from I was taking the similar talk to this in the Port Macquarie Church, and we're talking about it. And one of the members of the church who had a German background, he'd migrated not that many years before, and he came from this area, and he said, I'm going to tell you a story. This is the story I'm telling you. He said there was one person who came in and paid the top price for his indulgence tickets covering future sins. He came back that night and he stole the money. When they caught him, he said, but I got an indulgence ticket for all past sins. I don't know what the end of the story was because we both cracked up laughing, and maybe there's an end of the story or not, I don't know. But anyway, so this is what was happening, and this is what livid Luther. And so this is where the 95 Theses come in. Luther set out and wrote down 95 sentences they were, or statements, primarily dealing with the issue that indulgences do not get you eternal life. All right? And then he came along on the New Year's Eve. He nailed these 95 Theses up on the door to show that you cannot earn salvation, you cannot buy salvation, but salvation is a gift from Jesus Christ. You enter it through faith, by grace, to receive the grace that comes from Christ in the forgiveness for sins. And this was echoed right through these 95 Theses, particularly, as I say, hitting at indulgences. It was the eve of All Saints' Day. Now, this was significant because the man who I've already mentioned, Frederick the Wise, he was the elect prince of Saxony. He still was Roman Catholic, even though he became a great supporter of Martin Luther. He had a lot of pieces of, sacred cross and a nail here and all kinds of relics from the story of the Bible, particularly the story of Jesus, his own collection. And on All Saints' Day, they were going to be displayed here in the Cathedral Church, or the, as I said, the University Church as well, there in Wittenberg. And he thought if he put this statement up, he wanted to catch the attention of all the scholars and to have a debate. That's what he initially set out to do. Actually, the response initially wasn't so great. It wasn't until those 95 Theses were taken to the printer and they were then circulated across Germany that the message of these 95 Theses nailed to this door really took hold. It wasn't too long afterwards, but initially it was almost went flat. And his initial objective wasn't really met. And here's just a close-up photograph where you can actually see that these brass doors today, the original doors on the church that these were nailed to, it got burnt in one of the church fires that the church has had. This is a brass door, and they hope that even if the church did burn down, that these doors might survive. But you can see it's actually there numbered number 1, number 2, and so it goes on right down through to 95. I just want to mention this because we might just get enough time at the end to wrap this part up. Why I'm raising this question. Why are the musicians here on the top of the door of the thesis doors? Can you see them? And I'll show them to you in a bit more detail later. These 95 Theses are kind of the icon of Protestantism. Why have the local people put these musicians there? We'll come back and answer that question hopefully in a moment. Okay, the 95 Theses, obviously, as I said, they go to print. Luther gets an enormous reaction. He's called called to Augsburg, where he goes to trial there at the Damenhof, which is in fact, this particular part of it, the court area of the Damenhof, which was a palace, was where Cardinal Cajetan held a trial for Luther. but Luther actually managed to answer himself fairly well for here, and he went on his way. The next year, Dr. Eck, he was the chief Catholic theologian in Germany at that time, and Martin Luther had already had several encounters with him, but he has another very significant trial there in 1519. The next year, the Pope wants to get his bit in, so he issues a papal bull against him, and when the announcement arrives, Luther receives it. He's coming in from a visit outside the city, and at the point where you see the oak tree, there used to be a gate. And it was at these gates that Martin Luther was coming through when somebody issued or handed to him, here's the papal bull. And Martin Luther screwed it up and threw it into the fire that the guards were keeping warm by, just right there by the gate. And so that's why they call that the Luther Oak. There in Wittenberg today, it's in the place where the gates once were and where he did it. And you'll find different representations of where, again, Luther burning the papal bull. This is 1520. The next year, the Emperor, Charles V, and he's cleared a bit of ground here. He's been in trouble for a while. He's cleared a bit of ground, and it's time now to get on top of this Martin Luther stuff. And so he calls Martin Luther to Worms. And Worms is an imperial city. Now, an imperial city is a city that, unlike Saxony, doesn't have a prince-elect, but they sort of have declined that form of leadership, but they'll go direct to the emperor. And the emperor is the only one who has a say upon them. And Worms is that very city. So they feel they have an advantage by holding this trial in his imperial city, so to speak. And so off Luther goes to Worms. Now, the church itself, the cathedral itself, is not used, but the next door to the cathedral, there was the bishop's palace. Today, it's a garden, a piece of lawn. But inside the church, there's actually a model of what it used to look like when they actually had the bishop's palace there. And here you can see, again, a postcard, which was handy because it even shows it even better. But where that palace on the side of the cathedral is, that's where Martin Luther was tried. Today, there is just a plaque where Martin Luther was tried in the garden, and you'll see it as we get out of what happens in the trial. You remember these words. They're found in many places. But here is Martin Luther there before Charles V. It's a trial that takes place over many days. And finally, Martin Luther says, unless I am proven wrong by the evidence of the Holy Scripture or on clear rational grounds, then he says, I am convinced by the writings that I have cited, my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything. For to do so goes against one's conscience and is neither safe nor right. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen. They were Martin Luther's words as he finished what was his trial. And so at that particular point, Martin Luther, after making his final statement, and this is the plaque, by the way, in the middle of the lawn out in that garden that says this is where would have been the spot in the palace where he would have stood when that was all happening. And it's a great statement, here I stand, and it has been echoed many times more in Protestantism as well. All right. A little further away, of course, that was Catholic territory there. I did show you quickly, but didn't comment. There was a Lutheran church in the next street over where the story of Luther is commemorated. But in another street a little further away as well, there is what is known as the Luther Monument. Now, I've showed you this picture on a couple of times before. You know, here's Martin Luther standing, the forerunners seated around him. On the front, there are on the front two corners, there's Frederick of the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, and Philip of Hesse, another elector. On the other front one, a great supporter also, who you'll hear tomorrow in the story of Zwingli. And there's all significant people. 3 women are seated there representing the women of the Reformation. Speyer is protesting, Magdala is mourning, and Augsburg has the palm of peace, etc. And these were all significant events in the event of the Reformation in Germany. This is the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise. As I said, he never left the Catholic Church, but he became a great supporter of Martin Luther. And what he did was that he organised with his men as Martin Luther leaves the city, and Martin Luther left the city at night time, as he leaves the city, go out and capture him. Now I don't want to know what you do or where you take him, because they're going to ask me. I don't want to know, but go and securely keep him in hiding. And so, as Martin Luther leaves the city, he is captured by Frederick's men, and he is taken to what is known as the Wartburg Castle, and you see it there on the top of the hill. And it's an amazing castle actually to go to, and I'm going to slip over the first part when I'm showing you around the castle, and you can go and have a good look at it. It's, the rooms where people lived, into this part, which is really important to me. This was Martin Luther's cell there in the Wartburg Castle, and it was here where he made his translation. Do you notice there's an actual rope there, a guard kind of thing to keep you back so you don't touch it? But apparently, if you go forward and get your camera right over like this, you can get a photo like you see on the other side. I'm nearly there, getting a photo over the top, but it sets off the alarm. But guess who was standing beside me when it happened? This was my first tour with Harold Harker. And Harold's standing right there when I leant right over and set the alarm off, but I got the photograph, so there it is. And I won't stop to read that, but it's a statement that Martin Luther says, I'm about to start making a translation. It takes him about 2-3 months, and he finishes the entire New Testament translation, translating it into German. Once he finishes that, he wants to get out of the Wartburg Castle, and he does. He goes back to Wittenberg. And the interesting thing is when he goes back to Wittenberg, he will continue with the translating process, and some years later now, you can see that this is from 22 to 34, 12 years later, he eventually will finish the full translation of both Testaments, and that is published. But I want to read this to you. This was published by Time magazine. They said, Luther's Bible laid the cultural foundations for what later became a united German nation. That's interesting. Wherever we have found that the Bible was translated into the common language of the people, it happened at a time when it seemed to be a combining and a uniting effect upon that country at that particular time. Whether it's England with Wycliffe's Bible, whether it's Germany with Martin Luther's Bible, and we can go through the French translations that were made as well. These translations became the source of uniting many of the dialects that were around into one language, because it became the book to have, and everybody had the same book. And so that became important. Okay, Luther goes back to Wittenberg, and then I'm going to give you the conclusion of today tomorrow, because our time has finished. I just wanted to wrap up the Luther story simply by showing you that, the 5 what we call great solas of Martin Luther's time, and his what he stood for those, how they have come right down to where we are today. And I will include that in tomorrow's talk, because my talk on Zwingli is much shorter, and it's got a space there to put this part in. So if you don't mind, we'll leave that to tomorrow just to finish off. Can we just, again, have a word of benediction? Our Father, I pray that you would, again, help us to appreciate the great truth that Martin Luther set into the Christian church. The truth that in Jesus Christ we are set free. That in Jesus Christ we receive full and complete the salvation that God has for us. It's through our faith in Jesus and his gift of grace and the cleansing through his blood that gift is possible. May we all be recommitted to that gift today, and may we continue to walk with you as one who is a recipient of the gift that will take us right into heaven and will be demonstrated in our life, as we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.